Hello and welcome to Down to Earth with Terry Virts, where we talk about what matters down here on planet Earth. And if you love the podcast, please hit subscribe and give us a rating. Today we have Stefan Thomke on the podcast. Stefan has a PhD in electrical engineering as well as an MBA from MIT and is currently a professor at Harvard Business School, where we first met 10 years ago. Stefan, welcome on the podcast.
Great to be here.
You're in Boston now?
I'm in Boston now, yeah, and we've got a nice day outside. Sun is shining, which is great. September.
I love the fall semester at HBS. That's when I was there. A lot more than the spring semester.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And are you back to in-person classes, or are you still doing Zoom?
We're mixed. Well, what we're doing is we have the MBA program and it's now back in sort of in-person classes. But in executive education is where I teach right now, is we're still doing virtual. We don't do Zoom, but we've got something better, Terry. We've got the live online classroom, which is an amazing piece of technology where we try to essentially simulate sort of the in-class experience.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, for my listeners, you know this, but you and I teach a class together.
Exactly.
The last couple times we've done it via that system, and I think we're teaching it next week or in another week or two.
Pretty
and
soon.
Hopefully that's the last online. Hopefully we'll be back in person after that. But it's incredible. What
No,
Harvard,
no,
what
it's
you've done at
amazing.
Harvard is amazing. It's really, really much better than Zoom.
You know, Terry, a few people, what they told me about their experience, which was really impressive, is that they told me at the end of the classes is that it was so real that they forgot that it was virtual.
Right.
and that's what we're trying to do, create these class experience. And by the way, there's a lot of things that we learned as part of the experience, which I think will go beyond the pandemic. We've learned that we can actually create incredible learning experiences using virtual technology,
Right.
and that comes with a lot of benefits. People don't have to travel as much, because our programs are international programs.
Right.
But majority of people are from globally, from all over the world, and so they don't have to come. And then we also allows us also to make it more accessible, for participants. For example, we get more women in the program, which is great, which we love to have because of career, family issues. They're facing other trade-offs. And so it's great, so we get more diversity in the programs as well. So there are a lot of benefits that come with it.
Yeah, it's an amazing for the listeners. Normally, you're just looking at a screen, but this system that you have is like when you're the instructor, you have a big wall of people, and you can walk around and talk to people specifically. And you have a camera operator, so there's different views that are happening constantly.
Yeah, it's really
It,
cool.
I've been doing this guest lecturing there for years, and it's at once class ends, that's when the real benefit happens, right? Because then you go out for dinner, you hang out in the groups, and
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
what we're missing out on.
Yeah, and we're trying, we know that sort of the social side of the
Right.
experience, right? So the networking and all that. So what we've done is we've tried to create some networking experiences that are close to what you're usually doing. Yes, on
Right.
campus we just give you some beer and some wine, and
It works well. It works
it
really
works really
well.
well, yes. But here we have to step in. And so
Right.
for example, we've created a class which we call speed dating. And so what we do is, you can actually meet a lot of people very rapidly,
Right.
and
Right.
so forth. And so we've been really creative about doing these sorts of things. But
Right.
from the learning experience by itself, the learning experience is pretty equivalent to what you actually have in a classroom. And from my
Right.
perspective, actually, as a teacher walking in there, the LOC, so this live online classroom, is very natural. And that is, I can run around. I've got my
Right.
boards, I just look at walls of screens, so
Right.
each participant who's on the wall has a camera, has a speaker,
Right.
has everything. So I get directional information. The wall is pretty high. It goes all the way. If you imagine, I'm a pretty tall guy. I'm about 6'2",
Yeah.
but it goes all the way up to about 7.5 feet. And so we've got about 96 participants on this wall, and I interact. I can walk up to them. I can look at them.
Right.
I can do a lot of things that I do in the classroom. Yeah.
No, it's something, everybody listening here has either been to work online or is running an organization where they do online. And I think the kinds of things that Harvard has pioneered could be valuable, excuse me, for a lot of organizations for sure in the
Yeah. Yeah.
future, not just during COVID, but even in the future.
Terry, it's a technology, right? Just
Right.
like with many technologies. So
Right.
also meant Zoom is a technology.
Right.
And so we just had to relearn how to use the technology. And,
Hmm.
at the end of the day, our objective is the same. And the objective is to create transformational learning experiences. And whether we use Zoom or this LOC or the physical classroom, it's always the same objective. So we
Right.
have to then go back and innovate, and we have to kind of rethink the experience, what it's
Right.
like to sit there. And there are a lot of things that actually change, whether you're on Zoom or whether you're on the LOC or anything. And there are some things, for example, when you're in the classroom, Terry, you may remember, right? You don't get to pick your seat.
You don't. You have a name tag there, and that's where you go.
That's exactly, you walk in,
Right.
and we
Right.
basically control you. I mean, we control you, put you in a room, you put you in a
Right.
seat,
Right.
you have very little degrees of freedom actually in the room
Right.
here. When you're going online, we can't do that, right? Because
Right.
people are sitting at home, they're sitting in hotel rooms. Yeah, I just
Right.
had a guy who actually rented a cabin on a mountain, for the duration. So we can't really control that. So we have to
Right.
rethink sort of how we do some of these things, but the objective is the same.
Hmm. That's a great idea because the problem I know when I went through 10 years ago, I had small kids, and if I would have had to do that from home, like everybody who's working from home now, there's pluses and minuses, but with the kids running in the background and stuff, and the benefit of Harvard Business School is that you get away from that. You're in your living group. You really can shut off the outside world.
Yeah,
So you have to figure out how to recreate that aspect of it because it's not just learning the information; it's also
exactly.
the interpersonal and getting away from your daily life.
And now
That's
you
the
throw in
harder thing.
time zones, Terry.
Yeah.
You know all about time zones, right? So
Oh, yeah.
now we've got participants who sit in Tokyo
Right.
and in
That's brutal.
Singapore and New
That's
Zealand
brutal.
and
Yeah.
places around the world. So they're basically just flipped. So when we're awake, they're asleep. And so they have to completely change sort of how they live, how
Yeah.
they sleep.
At NASA, we called that Orbit One. So, Mission Control is there 24/7, but the Orbit One is like from midnight to 8. So that was the graveyard shift. So
That's
basically,
great.
all those guys are on Orbit One when they're going to one of these programs.
So I may use that if you allow me to steal that.
Please.
Right now we call it Harvard Standard Time.
That's funny. Well, it's something. It's not just talking about Harvard. It's really talking about everybody on Earth has to learn how to do
Exactly.
this. So you mentioned that all the students are from, not all, but probably 85% are not American. They're from all over the world.
That's during normal times, but what we're
Right.
finding as well during these times that we actually get a higher percentage of US participants
Huh. Interesting. Well,
than
because of the time
during
zone.
pre-pandemic time. Yeah, I
Right.
think time zones will be an aspect.
Right.
And what we're doing right now, Terry, is even though we were completely virtual last year, we're actually now going back to a hybrid model where we
Hmm.
actually have a virtual module, right, which we're in
Right.
right now, but which will be followed up by an on-campus module, which in this case right now will be in November. And I think that's what the future is going to look like. We're just going to mix the two up. We'll have the best of virtual and the best of on campus. And so participants can experience both.
Very cool. Well, so listening to your accent, it doesn't sound like you're from these parts. So what's your background? Like tell me a little bit
So
about your story.
oh, I got a long story. So I grew up in Germany. So I went to school there, finished school, and when I was around 19, I decided to do something really radical for a German. I decided to study engineering.
What part of Germany?
Grew up near a small town named Kalfes near Stuttgart, Germany.
Ah,
So Black Forest area.
yeah,
Uh,
Schwarzwald and
Schwarzwald, exactly.
and
Yeah, yeah.
Porsche land, right?
Oh, very close. Yeah. So
Yeah.
very far. It's less than an hour from where I grew up.
Well, my name is
Mercedes as
Virts,
well.
and they have a town named after me, Würzburg.
Yes, spelled slightly differently.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But in the Air Force, I was in Germany for 3.5 years, and it was my favorite place in the world. I felt more at home there than just about anywhere. So my family's all from Germany hundreds of years ago. So
No, that's great. That's great. Yeah. So clearly, automotive was a big influence. You can imagine in this area, like every other neighbor works for either Mercedes or Porsche or so.
right, right, right.
Yeah, yeah. So that's where I grew up. But even as a teenager, I was always in love with electronics, and so I wanted to become an electrical engineer. Electronics at the time was like magic, and so
Right.
uh, and then I decided, there's another German word which you may have heard called Sturm und Drang. It's basically when you want to go out and explore. And so I went to the US to go to college, and ended up first at the University of Oklahoma, and
Oh, wow.
which is, okay, yeah, exactly. And it was great because that's the only place I knew. Quite honestly, I had never heard about places like MIT or anything like that. I was just a boy growing up in a small town in Germany.
Right.
But I knew about Oklahoma, and it was kind of the way I always imagined the US to be from movies. And it was fantastic. People were super friendly there,
Yeah.
and the university was great. And that took me then to Arizona for a graduate degree, and where I was in Tempe, Arizona, which was always great. My dream was always to walk around campus full of orange trees.
Yeah.
And then I ended up at
When were
MIT.
you there? When were you at ASU?
I was at ASU from 1988 to 1990.
I, I was there too at Williams Air Force Base going through pilot training.
Oh, really? That's
Yeah.
amazing.
That is amazing. And my wife was at ASU. She graduated in 1990. That's
Oh,
amazing.
wow. So she was the
Yeah.
same class as I was in.
Hmm.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah. Accounting
So
though, different.
accounting. So I was
Yeah.
just going to ask because I was a teaching assistant there,
That's
and
amazing.
in electrical engineering.
Right.
And each time I graduated, I kind of try to figure out what I wanted to do. And it was about going back to Germany. I was an international student, so I couldn't really work.
Hmm.
And then I wanted to stay. I had worked actually in Germany every summer, and really loved sort of my experiences there. So the way to stay was just to keep on going to school.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then I applied for PhD programs, and then MIT was super generous, and offered me basically a full sort of scholarship, so I didn't have to pay anything. So I got to MIT, and
Wow.
I had a problem when I moved to Boston because I had no long pants. So the first thing I had to do is I had to actually redo my wardrobe when I
Yeah.
arrived in Boston, which was much
Boston
colder
is
there.
not Phoenix.
Exactly,
They
exactly.
are
It's
very different.
a lot of fun. So that's how I ended up. So it's a long sort of with many detours. Ended up at MIT. Again, I always worked at the same time in the summers and all. And then finally, when I was finally done, when there were no more degrees to get, uh, I actually went back to Germany. But then I had an amazing advisor who kept on talking to me about academic careers and all that.
Hmm.
And the deal that we made is to apply to one university, which was Harvard at the time. And I didn't think it would work out. I was ready to do something else, and then I got an offer from Harvard Business School to join the faculty in 1995. And
Oh,
so the
wow.
rest is history. Yeah,
So you've been teaching there for 25 years.
more than that if you do the numbers. It's
Wow.
26 starting by
Yeah, yeah,
27.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, I'm getting up there.
Mm, that's amazing. Wow. So you've seen a lot of things happen. My good friend Kenton Lietzau, actually from the Air Force Academy, got an
Yeah.
MBA in the 90s. I don't know if you remember him. He's one of those underachievers. After the academy, he went to MIT to get an engineering degree, and then he went to Harvard Business School to get an MBA. So he's one of these slackers. So you have seen a lot of students over the years.
Seen a lot of students. I've seen a lot of technology. I've seen a lot of
Yeah,
things, yeah, over the years. Even before HBS. Yeah.
right. Well, that's what I really wanted to talk to you about today was technology. And
Mhm.
this podcast, we have a lot of different guests from. I have no standards, so I bring all kinds of people on.
Thank
But
you.
technology was the thing that really stood out to me. And in your role, working with all these different business leaders from around the world, I just wanted to get your take on what technology is interesting, what problems we were talking about nuclear power. I'd like to talk about that
Sure.
maybe to start things off and then move on into electronic stuff.
Great.
Yeah.
So, man, first of all, I think, and that's really, I think, maybe interesting for your listeners, especially your younger listeners. You have to imagine, I and maybe you as well. I grew up with rotary phones.
Yeah.
You'd actually have to like turn the
Yeah.
dial to call a number, and vinyl records
Yeah.
and things like that. These were my teenage years, and I was dabbling with electronics. I built my own amplifiers and you name it, and at the time, as I said earlier, it was magical, and I thought at the time, boy, we've come so far, what else is there? If
A
someone had
push
told
button
me
phone. What else could you hope for?
if someone had told me, Terry, back then,
Yeah.
that at some point you could actually make a phone call with a watch.
Yeah. Like this.
Yes, exactly. Someone You could make a phone call with a watch. I mean, I would have thought you've lost your mind. And in my
Other than
lifetime,
James Bond. Right.
in my lifetime, and at the time already, this was at the time when first personal computers came out. You remember TRS-80, so Model 1, so Radio Shack had a first personal computer. Atari had a 400, 800. I mean, so these were at the time, and I was writing software for them for fun as well. But in any case, so I've seen the whole evolution, and it is really phenomenal. Even when I was at ASU and I was taking a graduate course on expert systems and neural networks. This was in the late 1980s.
Yeah.
And which was amazing. And we were designing neural network chips back then. But at the time, I really couldn't imagine what we see today, which is kind of phenomenal in terms of what you can do with these kinds of things. We were just toying around back then. Yeah.
So, when you say neural network, I can't help but hear Arnold Schwarzenegger and his Austrian accent, but in Terminator 2, talking about the neural network when the Skynet took over the world. I saw that movie at ASU, by the way, which is crazy when it first came out. So, and it's funny, I just wrote a foreword for a book for a friend of mine who's writing a book, and I was writing about my Atari. I wrote about my TRS-80, where I learned how to program in BASIC. So I think you and I had the same teenage years. And I used to I built a radio. We used to get these from Radio Shack, was the company.
Yeah.
I'm sure Harvard has a case study about Radio Shack and its woes probably. Anyway, so yeah, we had the same things. But that story is pretty well told, right? Everybody knows, yes, technology's advanced a huge amount. And there's the electronic data, AI aspect of technology. There's the energy aspect of technology. There's transportation. There's a lot of, there's medical, obviously. Everybody in the world knows what RNA vaccines are now. So there's kind of different buckets that technology go in. For me personally, energy is interesting. When I wrote some papers in high school about nuclear energy, we were going to run out of oil, was going to be gone by the 70s. I remember I had a book. I wrote the paper in the 80s, but the book said that by 1979 there wouldn't be any more crude oil. So what areas of technology interest you?
So I mean, Terry, I think you make a great point. It's not, I think my point was not that technology is advancing fast. I think my point is that even people who are close to it can't really predict it, what will happen.
Yeah.
And, I was pretty close to it. And at the time, in the late 1980s, sort of, it was all about expert systems, basically rule-based expert systems. So you take experts like doctors and you try to pull all these rules out of their heads, like basically take their experience, you write them down. And then you have these expert systems basically doing a diagnosis based on sort of what the doctor knew. And at the time, people thought that, neural networks were just too far out, because you needed a lot of data to train them. You needed relatively fast computing, to teach these neural networks. A lot of the theoretical work back then was done. I still have the textbook. Greg Hinton, I mean, they were the pioneers sort of in the field. That work was done, and we still didn't know. And lo and behold, nowadays nobody talks about expert systems anymore, which was sort of the hot thing back then. It's all neural networks. And so first of all, I think the first point, it's really difficult to predict what will work and what will not work
Right.
in the future, because things can kind of shift around very quickly. Yeah.
That reminds me of your book. And by the way, I'm so mad. I have your book next to my computer in my office, but not in my studio. But I think that's maybe part of. Can you talk about the book that you have at your
Yeah,
recent
so I have
book?
a new book, called Experimentation
Right.
The Surprising Power of Business Experiments. And I've spent a big part of my career sort of thinking about experimentation, business experimentation more lately, but experimentation more general, and sort of on the role and the power of experiments in scientific advances. And it's kind of interesting, Terry, if you go back and look at history, the scientific method, I mean, the first real book that pushed things forward was a book that was written in, excuse me, in 1620, called Novum Organum. Francis Bacon wrote this book.
Hmm.
And it's a really interesting read. Old English, not so easy,
Right.
but that kind of put in place a lot of sort of the foundation of what we later called the scientific method. And so it's been 400 years. And a lot of the things that
Wow.
we've seen are sort of technology advances are the direct result of the scientific method. And even you talked about, messenger RNA and things like, I mean, these are technologies that we've known about these for decades.
Right.
But it's because of the scientific method, we've been able to advance these things. And an important part of the scientific method is the experiment.
Right.
You can't imagine that scientific method without experiments. And so I've been thinking a lot about advances in experimentation, how to run experiments most effectively, and so on. And now in this new book, it's a lot about online experiments, how Facebook and Netflix and all these companies
Yeah.
are actually running experiments on you and me, Terry, and your
Hmm.
listeners.
Yeah. I got to say, the other day, I said out loud, um, we need to get some coffee cups, or those little coffee pods. My daughter loves these coffee pods or
Yeah.
whatever. And then 15 minutes later, I hear ding ding ding, and I say, Alexa, read me my notifications. And my Alexa said, "Hey Terry, if you haven't, you may want to think about buying some coffee pods." I mean, when there's all these conspiracy theories about that thing spying on you, but anyway, your point of they're running experiments on me. Yeah, I had that
A
firsthand.
lot.
Yeah, that was kind of spooky.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is that I think your listeners, I bet in the last 24 hours, they either used Netflix,
Yeah,
Facebook,
yeah,
Amazon, I
yeah,
mean, name any of them. And
yeah,
the reality is that all these companies are running tens of thousands of experiments each on you
yeah,
and me
yeah.
annually.
Right,
And so everyone who's listening here has been part of an experiment. And why they're doing it, of course, they want to figure out ways sort of to get better engagement. They want to understand sort of what you like and you don't like, because focus groups and things like that don't really work that well.
right,
And so the only way to really figure out sort of what you like and don't like is to look at your behavior. And so that's what they're doing, and they're just doing it at large scale now.
right. So I want to talk about that. Have you seen The
Sure.
Social Dilemma, by the way, the documentary, The Social Dilemma?
Well, I saw parts of it
Yeah,
recently, yes, and there was
it's
some. There
about,
were discussions about this discussion about whether it's ethical or not ethical and all that. That's an
yeah,
interesting one too. By the way, it's used in
algorithms.
politics as well, Terry.
Yeah.
They're running tests, these kinds of tests in the political domain too. So,
And the scary thing is it works.
oh
I mean,
yeah,
it works really well to the tune of trillion. Who are the big five? What's the acronym? Apple, Google, Facebook. Um, they're worth trillions of dollars. It's insane. When you look
yeah.
at the top, the Fortune 500 companies, 10 years ago it was Exxon Mobil and companies that did things, and how that's changed. And so I think one of the points of the book for those business leaders who might be watching is that R&D is important.
Oh
That's a
yeah,
budget. That's a line item that's always targeted, right?
exactly. And R&D is not just R&D. That is, even when you're sitting in marketing and you're trying to optimize, an experience that a customer has,
Right.
that is also in quotes R&D.
Right. Right.
And
Right.
it's not just the R&D or the engineering function. Basically, to me, I have this thing in the book called the experimentation organization, where basically everyone in an organization ought to experiment, where
Right.
experimentation becomes a little bit like breathing or like running the numbers. It becomes second nature. So if you don't know something, one way to find out is just to run the experiment and kind of see what happens.
I can envision having worked in the government for 30 years and I worked in the Air Force and NASA, which are
Sure.
supposedly, big, high tech, fancy things. But we used to joke at NASA puts the no in innovation. There, any bureaucracy is going to have resistance to change, resistance to anything new, and so I can see somebody thinking, oh yeah, we should try this out. But whenever you're testing or experimenting, I can see natural bureaucratic resistance to that. How do you overcome that?
Well, there's a number of ways sort of to deal with that. There's one great, Jeff Bezos has this one great speech where he actually talks about, how do you get things done in large organizations? And he admits that Amazon is a large organization as well, just like, NASA or any other
Right.
organization. And he makes this great point. If you're a venture capitalist, and you need to get something done, you need funding, right? You go to Sand Hill Road and you go to the first VC and they say no. You go to the second VC, they say no. And you may go to 25 VCs and they all tell you no until you find one that says yes. And you need just one yes and you're good to go.
Yeah.
And so he said he was trying to set up something like that at Amazon as well, that you can actually go to five senior executives and you get a no. But if you get a yes from one of them, you're good to go. And he says that even when he says no and somebody else says yes, he's fine with that. And
Hmm.
so he needs to create an organization where he calls it multiple paths to yes, rather than just one path that you have to kind of run up. And I think that's actually a really good insight in organizations, because if there's only one path to yes and that requires 5 or 10 signatures, of course people are not going to try anything. They may try it once and then they get so frustrated that the second time around they won't have any new ideas, so they don't want to try anything new.
That's amazing. I've never heard that story before, but that I can see that that's exactly wow. That's an amazing idea. I've also heard not no, but yes if. So, if you're a boss, excuse me, we're both coughing here. Hopefully we're not giving each other COVID. Um,
Have some water.
I've got my Coke Zero. Um, so bosses shouldn't tell their people no unless it's just, needs a no, but tell them yes if, like
Well,
that sounds like a good idea, but we need to get over these
the,
hurdles first.
Gary, there's another solution. So company booking.com, which I'm sure you've used and
Hmm.
many of your listeners have used. It's the world's largest accommodation platform. More than pre-COVID, there were more than 1.5 million room nights were booked each day on that
Wow.
platform. And but when it comes to experiments, they empower people.
Hmm.
Anybody in the company can run an experiment online on you and me without management permission. And that's scary, isn't it?
That's
Right? So
scary. Yeah.
yeah. But the next thing, of course, the next question comes up. So what are the checks and balances here?
Yeah.
Well, the checks and balances is the community. And that is, when you want to run an experiment, you have to be totally transparent. So you would broadcast it to everybody that this is what you're planning to do, and people can give you feedback. And if they think you're doing something silly or something that has been done before or something unethical, the community will immediately tell you. And by the way, anybody in the company also has the right to stop any experiment, not just theirs,
Oh, wow.
which they call the nuclear option.
Right.
And so if you see something that's just outrageous or completely unethical, you can go in and actually stop the experiment. And so they created kind of an environment. Now, why did they do that? Well, they figured that if you want to go to scale, if you want to do this, I don't know, 40, 50, 60,000 times a year, you can't have a management committee signing off on each
Bureaucracy,
of these
right?
things, because you're
Right.
running hundreds of these things, each day.
Hmm.
And so that it has to be sort of a way for this kind of to scale without, people overseeing it and signing off on things and so forth. It just doesn't work.
Right. So, and I think this is in your book, right? The story.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So, um, for tech companies to set up an algorithm and see if people need to buy their coffee or not, and listen when they tell you they're not listening, but they really are. That's one thing. But what if you're Northrop Grumman or Lockheed and you're building airplanes? Or what if you're Exxon or whatever and you're building energy equipment? Do you have any good stories or companies that are actually doing physical experiments? Like
Yeah.
how do they work this mentality into their
So
business?
first of all, I would recommend for them to read my first book in 2003 called
Okay.
Experimentation Matters. And that book is all about the physical domains and how sort of things like simulation and modeling is changing how experiments are done.
Hmm.
And it's a little bit, are you a Beatles fan, Terry?
Yeah,
Yeah.
of course.
Well, you may remember the Beatles had like the Red Album and the Blue Album, right? The
Yeah.
Red Album was all about the classics, and the Blue Album was all about the new stuff.
Ah,
And I had
okay.
both. You know,
Right.
any Beatles fan sort of worth his or her salt had basically both of these things. And so the Red Album, the 2000 is that my 2003 book is my Red Album, and the new book is my Blue Album.
Ah,
And
okay.
in the Red Album, or in sort of the first book, there are all these stories about car companies, pharmaceutical companies, and so forth, and how they're using advances in experimentation, and that is advances in modeling, simulation, rapid prototyping, and all these kinds of things to make essentially R&D more productive, and which allows them to do things that could have never been done before. I mean, I'll give you a simple example, Terry. If you're a car company and you want to make your car safer, I mean, the way they used to do that, of course, you take a car and you put a crash dummy in the car, you put sensors on it and so forth, and you just crash it. And you do that over and over again and try to collect information. But it's really not a very effective way to learn how to make better cars. It's really more kind of a way to verify things. But you could have done now with computer simulation, you could actually model at the time already. You can
Right.
have very sophisticated models of actually these crashes. You can stop them anytime. You could look what happens actually at a particular segment of the car. What if I
Hmm.
change the material a little bit? What will happen to the crash and so forth?
Right.
And even better, in simulators, and I've actually seen one of these things, real driving simulators, you could actually give somebody something to drink. Which you could not ethically do, in
Right.
a real crash test, have a beer or two,
Right.
and drive the simulator, and let's see sort of how your ability to kind of to respond to things in a
Right.
simulator affects your your ability to respond to a dangerous situation. So you can do lots of different things that are just not feasible.
Right. So
Yeah.
you use simulation in the design part and then physical testing in the verification part.
Yes, I mean,
Not 100%, but yeah.
yeah, but even verification, I'll give you some interesting data point, which often scares people. This was a guy at the time, I was very deep into crash simulation. I actually wrote an article with some co-authors for Scientific American on how crash simulation works. And one of the things that we learned at the time is that just manufacturing variability, that is, when you manufacture a car, there's natural variability when you put them together because of materials and all that,
Right.
that at the time accounted for something like close to 30% variability in crash outcomes. So you're
Oh,
dealing
wow.
with sort of highly nonlinear systems.
Right.
And so even verification, the verification there is basically a government mandated test. Like, yes, crash at 40 miles per hour into an object that is 30% offset, and
Right.
so on. Like, how many crashes actually happen that way?
Right.
There are no crashes that actually happen exactly the way it's mandated. So it's a good safeguard to have. But if that's all you rely on, you're not going to make cars that are much safer. You have to go way beyond that. Yeah.
And that's an N of one, right? It's one
Well,
data point. It's not a thousand.
yeah. And they pull out what they used to do, Terry. What they do is, for the government to verify, they actually pull out of a car, out of sort of your normally sold cars. If your natural variability is already 30% or something like that, right? Who knows? They may be pulling
Right.
out a car on the good side of the distribution, but it
Right.
doesn't say anything about the other cars and so forth. Yeah. So Yeah, so that really sort of the advances are on the simulation, sort of the ability to run many experiments, virtual
Right.
experiments, physical experiments, and then basically design better solutions. But you can do it in manufacturing as well. You can, use experiments to create better manufacturing processes.
But the key is you have to have the right model, right? So you and I, the class we teach
Mhm.
together is why organizations fail, and it's about Challenger and Columbia, the space shuttle accidents.
Right.
And on Columbia, there was a piece of foam that hit the wing and it
Mhm.
damaged the heat protection system so that when Columbia came back to Earth, all that
Yep.
hot air burned the wing
Mhm.
off. And they had a software called Crater, and
Mhm.
it was designed to look at the tile, and if foam hits the tile, how bad, how big of a
Mhm.
dent is it going to be. So they used that software to during Columbia,
Yeah.
but it wasn't designed. It was like many times were the actual situation was many times worse than what the software
Yeah.
was designed for, and it hit in a different place than what the software was designed for. So the
Exactly.
cautionary tale there is simulation's great, but the assumptions have to match what you're actually simulating.
Correct. Correct. There are actually two aspects to this, Terry. One aspect is actually, does the model itself have enough fidelity? And then the other
Right.
aspect is somebody actually using it. And
Hmm.
there's a famous statistician, George Box, once said a very, very famous quote. He said, all models are wrong, some models are useful. Okay. And so, yeah.
But a statistician shouldn't say all. He should say, I have a 95% confidence that this model is wrong.
By definition, they're all wrong. Okay, they're all wrong. You can try to approximate sort of reality, but then at the same time, again, you have to use these things as well. Yes, and the trick, of course, is to complement it, right? That's where the power of simulation. You gotta, the simulation model is not going to be perfectly right, but then what's reality? Even if you build a prototype is just another model of reality. There are different ways to represent reality, and the best way sort of to go after it is to actually combine these different things and get as close to reality as possible. Everything is an approximation to reality except for reality itself.
This sounds like another movie like The Matrix or something.
Exactly.
So what other examples? I know you have tons of examples. Harvard does the case study for those who don't know. So
Yeah,
instead of just teaching a lesson, you actually look at a case of how does
correct.
Exxon or Ford or whatever do this. So what are some good examples or like stories that you have?
Oh man, I have so many.
Yeah.
First of all, Kevin, not everything. You can't run an experiment on everything, right? So there are limitations to this. So sometimes, just as you mentioned, when you n equals one, it becomes very difficult. Or if you say, for example, you want to do a buyout or a merger or something like that, sometimes it's very difficult sort of to run an experiment on that, or just
Hmm.
not feasible. So not everything can be tested sort of with an experiment, but many things can. Now, sometimes when you get an experiment back, it doesn't mean that you have to blindly follow exactly what the experiment says. There may be other reasons why you don't want to do something. There was a great story, which actually was in the Wall Street Journal sort of years ago, about Netflix. And they had actually had a new show, which I think I saw once. It was kind of called Grace, and I don't remember. It's which in front. I think Grace and Frankie was the show. Yeah,
Oh
Grace and
yeah.
Frankie.
Hmm.
Yeah, and they wanted to. They had a little sort of promo, right? They ran, and they want to kind of see whether people respond to the promo. So they played around with different promos, and what they learned is that the promo actually worked better if you leave Jane Fonda out.
Ah,
And now the question is, do you really want to do that? Do
right.
you do, because there may be contractual reasons, or
Right.
you want her to be on your good side, right? So now, even though customers prefer that, or viewers prefer that, so things like that will happen as well. There are great stories. There's another one which I love as well, and that sort of tells you how sort of the importance of doing this right. This was a test that actually a really interesting experiment that Microsoft ran. So this is another software company, of course. And so at the time, they were trying to figure out different ways sort of to get more user engagement, in their search engine. and um, and people were making suggestions every day, sort of their own employees. And then uh, one fine day, sort of one of the sort of employees thought, why don't we actually change the way we show the text? So what they had is they had actually very short headlines, Terry, and they had a lot of subtext because there was a feeling that if you make the headlines too long, people don't engage, right? Because people don't read anything. So let's keep it very, very short. And then all the details are below. I said, what if we pull some of the details from below up into the headline? And managers that thought, I've got a lot of other suggestions that are kind of on the plate that sound a lot better and all that. So the employee basically kind of stopped and waited for 6 months and nothing happened. At the time, the employee decided, I'm going to take matters into my own hands and just now, normally the way we would do that, of course, Terry, you have to figure out whether something like that works or not. Typically we run a focus group, right?
Right.
But we know that people in focus groups don't tell you the truth. They'll tell you that they want the salad and then they go out and they have a cheeseburger, right? So
yeah. Well, Trump, we thought he was going to lose the election, and then because everybody was embarrassed to say they were going to vote for him, and then they voted for him.
Exactly. Focus groups, just there's enough evidence that they're good for some things, but they're not so great for other things. And so in any case, in this case, the employee decided, let's go ahead and let's just run the test. Let's run it. And so it just took a few days of coding. He ran it. Microsoft has close to 2,000 KPIs, so automated, so key performance indicators that kind of tell you what's going on. And they're automated. And when something weird happens, there's a immediate shutdown, like in a nuclear power plant. When something weird happens, it shuts down the reactor.
Right.
So it's the same way. That alarm was called the too good to be true alarm. So it runs this thing, and some KPIs kind of go out of whack. The too good to be true alarm kind of shuts it down.
Right.
And then they wonder what's going on. Usually it's a software error, right? Someone makes a coding mistake or something like that. They can't find a mistake. They run it again, Terry. And same thing again, too good to be true, kicks in, shuts the thing down. They start to investigate, and then they scale it. And they realize this thing is real. And it was a 12% improvement in user engagement. Now for Microsoft, with such a lot of users, that translated into more than $100 million of additional revenue per year.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Because the one employee just changed the title of a thing.
Yeah. And now the thing is, and it's all that, and this is why experimentation is so important, because that's all money left on the table, right?
Yeah.
If the employee had never run the experiment, Microsoft would have never known, and they would have left more than 100 million on the table every single year.
So Microsoft needs the Bezos, just find a way to say yes, rather than you get one no and you're squashed.
Or empower them. You're good to go. Just run it.
Yeah. You're not going to lose the company. It's not going to cost a lot of,
No, probably not. As I said, they have mechanisms. If someone does something horrible, let's if you're one of the KPIs suddenly drops 90% in 5 minutes,
then they can fix that. Yeah.
The algorithm comes in and just shuts it down.
Right. That's an amazing story. It's also a cautionary tale for, in the government, you have GS is your rank, right? Like the GS5 is a low level, GS10 is kind of a mid level. The GS15s are the bosses. And then above that, there's the executives. But so we used to say he's a GS no. He wasn't a GS5 or GS10. He was a GS no. These people that just say no all the time.
In the field of experimentation, Terry, we have a word, we call it the hippo, right? The hippo. It's the highest paid person's opinion. And and we know from nature that hippos are the most dangerous animals. They kill a lot of people each year.
Yeah.
And so the hippos are sometimes the problem. You go into a meeting and sort of the highest paid person's opinion is weighed more heavily than the rest of the people who may actually know a lot more about sort of what you're trying to decide on. Yeah.
One of the books I read when I was there at Harvard 10 years ago was called The Wisdom of Crowds. Yeah. I forgot the Andrew Sadecki or something like that. Wojcicki.
Yeah.
And the opening story in that is when Challenger exploded, and this was in the 80s, before these things, before Twitter, before streaming, Fox News or whatever. all the stocks went down. Boeing and Lockheed and Rockwell and General Dynamics, all the contractors that were working on the shuttle went down. And I think it was within 15 minutes they all recovered except for Thiokol, which of course was the contractor that built the solid rocket boosters that caused the accident. And the point of that story was the stock market solved that problem pretty quickly, because it was a crowd. They all had access to the same information, and like group, it's a lesson in group decision making, right? The crowd, the crowd solved the problem. Where as the NASA managers months later still hadn't agreed. After Columbia happened, a month after the accident, I was on an airplane with the top manager going to a funeral at Arlington, and he was sure that it wasn't the foam. He was just, there's no way it could have been the foam. It had to have been a meteor or something that caused this accident. So my point is, oftentimes, to your experimentation point, like crowds and groups and can make better decisions than one person, one man or woman in charge.
And they have, that man or woman in charge may have the best intentions, but we all suffer from the same cognitive biases and things like that. I mean, that was the whole point of the 1620 book, Novum Organum. The book is all about biases and how humans are, we perceive the world through our senses and through our emotions, and people are just not very good at this sort of thing. And there's a great example, an executive that I use, Ron Johnson, who was, retail, when he's still around, retail god. He came out of Target. He helped Target actually to come up sort of with a new retail concept. Him and Jobs co-created the Apple Store. And so if you're like, if there's something like a retail godness, in terms of the hierarchy, he's way up there. And
he's not Zeus, but he's like Apollo, or
pretty high up there. Pretty close to Zeus.
Right.
And so JCPenney brings him in because of his amazing experience and what he's done and all that. He brings him in and to kind of redo sort of JCPenney, and he goes right ahead, full blast, And 18 months later, he's fired, and JCPenney's fighting for its survival. And so you may ask sort of what happened. Well, the sorts of things that he did at Apple didn't work for JCPenney. Having no cashiers, no coupons, and all these kinds of things that Apple would really work for Apple, for the people who go to Apple stores. JCPenney shoppers wanted to have these things. And when they were not there, they just stopped showing up. And it's interesting. So when you listen to him and he's talked public about this, he doesn't come across as someone who's arrogant or anything like that. But he calls it situational arrogance. He thought he had all the answers, and because he was so successful in the past, right? The past was almost kind of a validation that he must be right. And by the way, he did not run any experiments. He thought running experiments would just slow him down.
That's the point of our class about Challenger and Columbia is, these NASA managers weren't evil. They weren't trying to kill anybody, but they were arrogant, and that arrogance can be deadly for a company or a family or any organization, any human organization.
So humility. I think humility is really important I think in life in general, but also in management. And sometimes it should be okay to go into a room and tell people, I don't know what the answer is. But let's run a test or an experiment to find out. It should be okay. And it should be okay for the person all the way at the top to say that. It's not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of strength.
I would be, if I was the boss, I would be really happy about that. Well, so one of the things you were talking about earlier, and now I've got Penny Lane in my brain after you told me about the Beatles at Abbey Road. But you talked about neural networks, and now I can't stop hearing Arnold Schwarzenegger saying neural network too. But AI, we hear about AI all the time, neural network. Can you what is that? Like, I'm just a fighter pilot. So when you're talking about AI, or when you're talking about what is that?
Well, I mean, they're basically sort of different technologies that are trying to kind of mimic sort of, I guess at some level, the human brain, but they're models. They're not the real thing. And what you want to do is you want to actually sort of have the kind of learning or the behavior that human brain has, but they're very, very simplified. very simple. So a neural network is a very simplified sort of model. So it actually has sort of elements in there that are called neural connections and things like that. But again, it's a mathematical abstraction. It's not a really direct biological model, because the biological model would be way too complicated.
Right.
But even that is very powerful, right? And so what you do is you will actually construct this like a neural network, which is basically a network of neurons that are connected. Neurons with the neurons themselves are actually sort of mathematical sort of elements. Mm-hmm. And then there are methods like for example, we call back propagation. These are methods that are actually used to teach the network. So the way you would do that, Terry, is you would basically sort of take a very large data set, and then you'd feed the data set into the network, and then the outcomes of what happened, and then you basically teach the data set sort of coming to the same conclusions that you sort of use in the training set. And then once you take the training wheels away, you let the neural network sort of make decisions, and the decisions are sort of then supposed to be similar in terms of sort of what it knows to what happened sort of in the training set. Of course, the tricky thing there is you have no idea of what the network knows. You don't know sort of how it sort of trained itself, and that you kind of assume that it's there. So that's one aspect of AI. So AI is a lot of different, it's a big placeholder, right? So
right.
It's different things. Then there are others. There's a thing called machine learning. They're more statistical based models. But at the end of the day, they're all kind of models of things, different kinds of models that are sort of aimed at sort of trying to do what sort of humans do.
So there's a sensor that puts data in a computer, and the computer goes, if the sun's out, then birds are flying, and the sun's out and birds are flying, and the sun's down and birds aren't flying. And when it gets enough of these data points, the computer learns that, normally when the sun is up is when the birds are flying. And the key is to have lots of data. Right.
Yeah.
And
lots of data.
It's really fairly simple stuff. We think of it as being, this super complicated thing, but I think what you're saying is that it's kind of like if A, then B, and it sees a million of those, and then it knows that when you see A, you're going to see B.
Except it's not quite like that. So yes, it's not that complicated, Terry, but it's not rules. So if A, then B, right? That's a rule-based system, which we use in expert systems. But what it does here is the way it learns is, it has these, in quotes, neurons and connections between it. So it may actually adjust the strength of the connections, or sort of how different neurons interact with each other and so forth. And then you have layers of these different neurons. So you build layer after layer, which then have connections between layers and all that. So it's basically sort of a network of things that are connected, which have sort of elements and weights and so forth, and they're together. And then this algorithm, and then you're right, Terry, you then would tell it these kinds of things, you would give it that feedback, and then it sort of self-adjusts using mathematical sort of algorithms, self-adjusts sort of these connections. Now, the beauty in a rule-based system, like the if-then kind of system, we actually know, like if A happens, then you will do B, because it's well specified, like in an expert system. In neural networks, we don't. We just assume that it learned these kinds of things. And so let's assume you train, let's assume we train them, about birds, right? Sort of a neural network. And then we take the neural network to Mars or some other place.
Right.
It's a completely different domain. We don't know, once you move out of sort of the domain in which this thing was trained, whether it still comes to the right conclusions, so. And it's a guessing game. In rules-based, we could actually look at the rules, Terry, and we know if the rule is there, what it actually does. But neural networks, we really don't. But the thing why it's so powerful, it comes from the complexity itself, because we can do layer after layer. Earlier, Terry, I told you, right, when in the late 80s, we used to build like 2 or 3 layers or so of these kinds of neurons and make connections between them, and then try to teach them basic things. Now we have 1,000 layers.
Right.
1,000 layers of elements, and that are all connected. It's so complex. And so we don't really know what's inside the box. Yeah.
So will Skynet become self-aware like in Terminator 2? I just watched 2001, one of the best movies of all time. And of course, that's all about HAL.
Exactly.
Which is IBM minus one letter. You know, it's I is H, B is A, and M is L.
That's
And
the rumor, yes.
yeah. Well, or maybe, right. So, but there's a bunch of things in that movie, but it's really about how the computer becomes self-aware and wants to kill the people.
Yeah.
And it, and I felt this for a long time as an Air Force guy. I was in the Air Force for over 30 years, and we have all these drones, and I'm really, really concerned about where we're going with drones. I don't think it makes war very easy, right? If you can just kill with impunity and not there's a issue there. And Isaac Asimov had his three rules of
A
robotics,
robot.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Robots can't harm people. They can, if by inaction they can't let people get harmed, and they have to protect themselves unless that overrides the first two. I think we're essentially.
Mhm.
And do we have anything like that, or do we need it? I think we do, but
I think
I don't think.
eventually,
Yeah.
Terry, I think, but right now, I'm not too worried. I mean, first of all, right now, it's kind of amazing what these networks can do. And they will actually take tasks that are just humans are not very good at, that is taking a lot of information in and making sort of very quick decisions. It's kind of powerful. Pattern recognition, for example, facial recognition, all these
Yeah.
kinds of things. uh, it's really great. I mean, the kinds of things that we can do with that. Will at some, I mean, yes, I mean, there is a risk, right? You can train a neural network to be very evil. You just use an evil training data set and it learns sort of all the evil things. Yeah, yes, in theory, you could do that. And I think eventually that's going to be a dilemma for us as these things are getting better and better. I mean, we're talking about timescales, Tara, here, right? So when I was a teenager, that was 40 years ago.
Yeah.
Earth is 4.5 billion years old. And
Yeah.
so, yes, I mean, the next 100, 200 years or something, we may be heading towards something like this, the singularity
Right.
and all these things. But I don't think we're there today.
Describe singularity. What does that mean?
Well, I think this is where like your consciousness kind of merges, at some point your consciousness kind of merges with sort of the consciousness in the machine. It all becomes one and the same.
Right.
And so we don't live in our bodies anymore. We're basically,
The
we
Matrix.
could, yeah, Matrix.
Yeah.
You could, Terry, you could have that Terry Virts in the machine, and your consciousness could sort of continue to exist and all that. And
Right.
who knows? Who knows right now? Again, earlier I said we're not very good at predicting things. Is it impossible? We'll have to see. There's a lot more that we need to learn before we get there. Right now, quite honestly, we can't even model the human brain. Just even modeling sort of a simple neuron or even simple mechanisms like protein folding and things like simple biological mechanisms, require a massive amount of computing power. And so there's a lot more work to be done. But for simple things, it's amazing, right? Sort of what we
Yeah.
can do. Again, speech recognition, pattern recognition, all the things that kind of affect our daily lives. The fact that I can drive my car and tell them, give them, just take me to Harvard Business School, right? I don't have to
Right.
say anything else, and bang, it pulls out GPS data, and here it goes. I mean, it's amazing.
You have a self-driving car?
Not self-driving,
Oh
but
yeah.
yeah, I'm not yet. I like to drive, Terry.
Yeah. You're German.
But I could,
Yeah.
you could, I mean, you could just tell it, take me to Harvard Business School, take me somewhere, just
Right.
tell the car and it takes you there. And so that's pretty amazing.
Yeah. The one of the concerns it's either the glass is half full or glass is half empty. What technology can do is amazing, but I think one of the biggest threats to humanity is automation, because there's a lot of jobs that are going to be they already have been, right? I mean, this is one of the political problems in America has been the loss of manufacturing jobs.
Mhm.
And I think that's only going to get a lot worse. And certain countries are more susceptible, countries that
Correct.
generate their income like China on lots of low income, that's going to go away. And so that's like a threat to society. But you were talking about pattern recognition, and it's amazing what that can do. And back talking about China, it's also, it's the 1984 has arrived. 1984 is alive and well, right? And this goes back to some of this technology can be good and some of it can be used for evil too.
Absolutely. Every technology brings risks. Every technological revolution, even the industrial revolution, there were a lot of concerns. employment is often a huge concern, but the reality is, we've changed. Different kinds of jobs have arisen, of course, that will require different level of education and things like that. These are all big disruptions. But people had these concerns during the first industrial revolution as
Right.
well. When we went from farming to manufacturing,
Right.
what are all these people going to do? And so I think that will continue to be a challenge, and we have to deal with that. I mean, that's if there's a role for politicians or our government is to make sure that these transitions are kind of made in a humane way,
Hmm.
that people are not left behind. But they will continue going forward. I think that's not going to change. Every technology will come some risk. I'm a
Right.
glass half full guy,
Yeah.
and because I see a lot of the possibilities, and the reality, though, Terry, sort of along the way, it has raised overall productivity and quality of life for
Oh
for
yeah.
for most people on the planet. Even though maybe inequality has increased, but if you look at sort of the average and lifting things, it has lifted things. People are healthier than ever. I mean, there are lots of different things. The fact that we could actually, I mean, now with a pandemic, the fact that companies could come up with a vaccine within weeks after the genome was available. I mean, weeks. Most of the time in vaccine was just clinical trials,
Yeah.
but the actual design of the vaccine was weeks. I mean, that just blows your. I mean, I don't know. It blows my mind.
It's amazing. In fact, I was at Harvard teaching like the
Yeah,
week before everything shut down,
yeah,
and one of your students was a Moderna.
yeah,
I don't know if you remember, employee. He
yeah,
worked right
yeah,
across the river,
yeah.
and we were talking about it, and those kind of things. Of course, you don't want to go backwards, and you don't want to give up, and
Exactly.
you don't want to go. A lot of people are like, yeah, if make America great again, as though we were better before. I think we're better now than we ever were.
Yeah,
And you don't want to give that up, but you also don't want to have machines do evil. I think robots
absolutely.
killing people is a really dangerous path, and they've been doing that for 20 years in Afghanistan,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
we're only that's only increasing, and those are the kind of things. The good news is we have a government that has a lot of 30 something and 40 something MIT grads that are really smart and can make agile decisions. Of course, I'm being facetious right now. The Unfortunately, our government is uniquely inept at trying to keep up with the market
I think we have
when
to
it
be
comes to
good.
tech.
I think one of the things is, I think, guiding principles, Terry, right? In all of this, we need to do good things, and
Yeah,
anything that basically helps us. The worst things on the planet is when people suffer, and so
yeah,
we should never do anything that makes people suffer. That's not humane.
right.
And so that's the role, I think, that we all have, even as technologists.
Yeah,
And I think you can do that. I think, Terry, you can walk that fine line. We've always walked that fine line, in sort of the history of the human race. And maybe as technology is getting more and more powerful, it's just harder because of all the different interests that are involved to find that right balance.
yeah.
But if you look at all the suffering going back, 100, 200, 300 years, oh my God, living back
Wow.
then, if you read these books, these were horrible times.
Yeah. No, today, I mean, thanks to technology in large part.
Yeah, I mean, you didn't
Mo-
even know whether your kids would make it to age 5 or 10. I
yeah,
mean, that
that's why
was
you had to have
actually
10
rolling the
kids.
dice, huh?
Yeah. Yeah, that's why you had to have so many kids. There's a
Yeah,
book by Hans Rosling. Have you read that?
yeah, yeah. I've seen it.
Factfulness.
Yeah, yeah. It's yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
It
And
it
there's another
good.
Steven Pinker, one colleague over sort of in at Harvard, sort of who's written really, you know, I think an important book. He kind of points out, if you look at all the objective statistics, whether you look at crime, health, and all these kinds of things, it's never been better than, like,
Yeah.
today has never been better than ever
Right.
before. And so we need to kind of keep that in mind. I mean, you just look at the raw numbers, and
Right.
that's not just for the elite, I think for everyone. And so let's keep that in mind, and continue to go down this path, make even things better, not more just more profitable, but better for everyone. Yeah.
Right. 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 And I think that business has a really important, bring it back to Harvard Business School.
Yeah.
I mean, the government is just not good at most things. The government's good at taxing and generating money, right? There's a lot of money there, but they're not innovative, and that's where businesses can solve the climate crisis, and lots of
Yeah,
businesses are working on that. And I think things need, if things are going to get done, they're going to have to get done, at least in America, through businesses.
I think so.
Yeah,
I think it's by and large, I think look at other countries as well. I mean, you could sort of quibble about, governments being, more or less efficient, but I think the
right,
challenges are the same. Business plays a huge role in this,
right,
and can be really a force for good.
yeah,
And leaders need to take that very seriously. Yes, it's not just about maximizing profits. It's about, changing people's lives and make sure, that
right,
we kind of move in the right direction. Yeah, I agree. Governments are kind of set up for some things that they do, and we should be clear about what that role is. And whether they're good at taxing or not, that's a different question for some other podcast or not. But
yeah, yeah, that,
but they're not. What I can tell you, they're not very responsive, and so
right,
because again, people are driven by different motives and so forth. I mean, it's just set up. It's a different setup, and so we need to kind of have a good sense of what they're good for, and they play a good role. I think natural defense is one. Basically where the market kind of doesn't work, and that's good. We need that as well. But then we
right.
should kind of get out of the way and let businesses do what they do best. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think that's probably a good place to end with that. We could talk for hours about technology and tax
Sure.
policy and German beer and German food, and which I miss a lot. There's a few good places here in Houston, but not a lot. But
Yeah, I get the
anyway,
taste of it once in a while. I was just in Germany a few weeks ago. It's
yeah,
always
lucky. Yeah, the travel has been off. Hopefully that'll end, get back to normal
yeah,
soon, but it's
yeah,
going to take some time, I think.
yeah. It's a
Um,
tough one too.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having Frank. Thanks for coming on the show, Stefan. And just to remind everybody about your book, Experimentation Works, is really great. If you run an organization or if you work in an organization, there's some really good information there. And um, I'm
Um,
looking forward to seeing you
yeah,
on electronically here in shortly, but hopefully in person next semester.
yeah. No, same here, Terry.
All right.
Looking forward to doing more classes together.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
thanks
Take
for coming
care.
on
Yeah.
Down to Earth.
Thanks.
All
Thank
right.
you.
All right.
Take care. Bye bye.